Two disasters are unfolding in America at the exact same hour, and almost nobody is telling you they are the same storm. 1,000 miles to the north, an outbreak that belongs to April is spinning violent tornadoes across the Midwest in the middle of June. And down on the Gulf, the season's first-named storm, Arthur, is doing something a tropical system is not supposed to be able to do, holding itself together over land and threatening to come roaring back to life on the far side of the country. One enormous overloaded pattern is driving both, and Arthur is the half that is breaking the laws of hurricane science. The question that should stop you cold is simple. What kind of atmosphere produces a June tornado outbreak and a rule-breaking storm on the very same day? If that question grabs you the way it grabs me, subscribe to the Sky Lab, because connecting these dots is what we do here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what the sky looks like over you right now. Let's get into it. Part 1. The storm that refuses to die. There is a rule in meteorology so old and so reliable that most of us learned it as children without ever being taught it directly. Land kills hurricanes. A storm is born over warm water, it feeds on warm water, and the moment it drags itself ashore and loses contact with that water, it begins to die. We have watched it happen 100 times. The satellite loop shows a tight, furious spiral approaching the coast, and within a day of landfall, that spiral unwinds into a shapeless smear of rain. The engine starves, the storm weakens. That is how it is supposed to go. Today, on the 17th of June, 2026, a storm is about to break that rule in front of all of us. Its name is Arthur, and a few hours ago the National Hurricane Center made it official, upgrading a system they had been tracking for days into the first-named storm of the 2026 Atlantic season. On paper, Arthur is almost unremarkable. It is not a major hurricane. It is not even close. Its winds at the coast are modest, the kind of tropical storm that in any other week would earn a few headlines about beach erosion and then fade from memory. If you only looked at its strength, you would shrug and move on. But strength is not the story here. Behavior is the story. Because the forecast models that meteorologists trust most are showing Arthur doing something that a tropical system is not supposed to be able to do. They are showing it crossing the coastline, moving inland over hundreds of miles of the deep south, and instead of falling apart the way the rule demands, holding itself together. And then, days later, and far from the Gulf that gave it life, they show it gathering strength again as it reaches the other side of the country and slides off the coast of the Carolinas. A storm that should be a corpse by Thursday may be reorganizing into something with a name again by Friday. If that sounds impossible to you, good. It is supposed to. The feeling you have right now, the small voice saying that cannot be right, that is the correct scientific instinct. A storm strengthening over land violates the simple version of hurricane science that almost everyone carries in their head. And when something violates a rule that fundamental, you are left with only two possibilities. Either the rule is wrong or something extraordinary is feeding this storm in a way we are not used to thinking about. Tonight we're going to find out which. Let me show you what we are actually looking at. Because the picture is stranger than a simple forecast track. Right now, as the storm sits over the northwestern Gulf near the upper Texas coast, it does not even look like a proper tropical storm. If you pulled up the satellite this morning expecting a clean swirl with the center buried under a dome of thunderstorms, you would be confused. The center of circulation, the actual low-pressure heart of the system, is sitting off by itself, exposed, with most of the violent weather shoved well to the east of it. Strong winds high up in the atmosphere are blasting across the western side of the storm, tearing at it, injecting dry air, and pushing all of the thunderstorm activity downwind. The result is a lopsided, ragged thing that an untrained eye would dismiss as falling apart before it ever began. That appearance is a trap. A storm that looks disorganized is not the same as a storm that is harmless, and it is certainly not the same as a storm that is finished. Some of the most dangerous tropical systems in history looked like garbage on radar right up until the moment they didn't. The convection being thrown to the east is dumping torrential rain into Houston and Galveston and reaching toward Louisiana, and that displaced energy is not being wasted. It is being thrown out ahead of the storm, priming the entire region for what comes next. So the very thing that makes Arthur look weak this morning is part of the mechanism that will make it dangerous for days. Here is the central question that is going to run underneath everything we talk about tonight. The thread I need you to hold on to no matter how far we travel from the Gulf. Why is this storm refusing to die? Not in a poetic sense, in a physical, measurable, this should not be happening sense. What is feeding a tropical system as it crawls across Mississippi and Alabama, hundreds of miles from any ocean, and what could possibly hand it a second life off the coast of South Carolina? Because if we can answer that, we are not just explaining one oddly stubborn June storm. We are looking at a clue about the state of the entire atmosphere right now, an atmosphere that is doing several things this week that it is not supposed to be able to do at the same time. And that is the part that should make you sit up. Arthur is not happening in isolation. At the exact same hour that this storm is breaking the rules over the Gulf, 1,000 miles to the north, a completely different kind of disaster is unfolding across the Midwest, and the two of them are connected by something much larger than either one. We will get to that. But to understand why a storm strengthening over land matters, you first have to understand exactly how impossible it is supposed to be. So let me take you inside the engine of a hurricane and show you precisely why land is supposed to be the thing that kills it. Part 2. How land is supposed to kill a storm. To understand why Arthur is so strange, you have to understand what a tropical storm actually is, and the answer is not what most people think. A hurricane is not a thing. It is a process. More precisely, it is an engine, and like any engine it runs on a fuel source, and the moment you cut off the fuel, the engine stops. Everything about the behaviour we are watching this week comes down to that one idea, so it is worth slowing down and getting it exactly right. The fuel of a tropical cyclone is warm ocean water. Specifically, it is the heat stored in the upper layer of a sea that is at least around 26 degrees Celsius, which is about 79 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way down through a meaningful depth. When the air sits over water that warm, the water is constantly evaporating, lifting enormous quantities of moisture into the lower atmosphere. That moisture is not just water, it is packaged energy. When water evaporates from the ocean surface, it carries away heat in a hidden form that scientists call latent heat. The energy it took to turn liquid into vapour. That energy travels upward with the water vapour, invisible, locked away, waiting. Then comes the release. As that warm, moisture-loaded air rises inside the storm, it cools, and the vapour condenses back into liquid water to form towering thunderstorm clouds. And condensation does the opposite of evaporation. It releases all that hidden heat back into the surrounding air. That release warms the core of the storm. The warm core lowers the surface pressure. The lower pressure pulls in more air from the surroundings. That incoming air races across the warm ocean and picks up still more moisture, and the whole thing feeds on itself. Evaporation, rising, condensation, heat release, falling pressure, stronger winds, more evaporation. Around and around. That is the engine. That is the entire secret of how a patch of disorganized thunderstorms over the tropics can wind itself up into the most powerful storm on Earth. It is worth pausing on just how much energy we are talking about, because the scale is genuinely hard to picture. A mature tropical system, even a middling one, is moving and releasing energy on a level that dwarfs almost anything human civilization produces. The heat released by the condensation inside a single storm, every single day it churns, runs into numbers so large they stop meaning anything to us, comparable to many times the total electrical output of the entire planet. And all of that staggering energy comes from one humble source, the slow, patient evaporation of warm seawater under a tropical sun. That is why the temperature of the ocean, and how far down that warmth extends, matters so much. A thin skin of warm water on top of a cold layer underneath gets stirred up and cooled by the storm quickly, choking the engine. But a thick column of warm water, warm all the way down, is a fuel tank that does not run dry even as the storm churns the sea beneath it. Hold that idea, because the depth and persistence of warmth is going to matter enormously when we get to why the Gulf this year is such a loaded gun. Now you can see immediately why the ocean matters so much. The warm sea surface is the fuel tank, and it is a fuel tank that refills itself continuously as long as the storm stays over warm water. The storm can rage for a week, 2 weeks, crossing an entire ocean basin, because everywhere it goes the warm water is right there underneath it, evaporating, handing up more latent heat, refilling the tank as fast as the engine can burn it. So what happens at landfall? Everything that fed the storm is suddenly taken away at once. The warm ocean is gone, replaced by solid ground, and the ground cannot evaporate moisture into the storm anywhere near as fast as a warm sea can. the fuel line is cut. On top of that, the land itself fights the storm in a second way. The surface of the land is rough. It has hills, forests, buildings, terrain, friction. A hurricane's winds spin most efficiently over the smooth, almost frictionless surface of the open ocean. Drag that circulation across rough ground, and the friction tears at the low-level winds, slowing them, disrupting the tidy inflow that the engine depends on. And there is often a third blow waiting inland, which is drier air. The air over a continent is frequently far less humid than the saturated air over a tropical sea, and when that dry air gets pulled into the storm, it acts almost like poison, causing the thunderstorms to weaken and collapse from the inside. Put those three together, the fuel is cut off, the friction increases, and the dry air invades. That is the textbook execution of a tropical cyclone, and it normally works fast. A storm that was a roaring hurricane at the coast can be a disorganized blob of rain 24 to 48 hours later. We say the storm has weakened to a tropical depression, then to a remnant low, and eventually to nothing but a swirl of leftover moisture that the next weather system sweeps away. Land kills hurricanes. The rule holds up because the physics behind it is rock solid. This is exactly why forecasters draw the cone the way they do, and why the official forecast for Arthur originally said precisely what the textbook would predict. The plan was simple and unremarkable. Arthur would reach tropical storm strength near the coast, make its closest approach, and then weaken back toward a tropical depression as it moved inland over Louisiana and crossed into Mississippi. Reach the land, lose the fuel, fall apart. Nothing about that is surprising. That is the storm following the rule like it is supposed to. And here is where I have to stop and make sure something is clear, because it matters for everything that follows. When a tropical system moves inland and weakens, that does not mean the danger is over. This is one of the most lethal misconceptions in all of weather. People watch the wind numbers drop. They hear the word depression instead of storm, and they relax. But the water does not care what category the storm is. Some of the deadliest tropical disasters in American history were not powerful hurricanes at all. They were weak, sloppy, falling apart systems that parked over an area and drowned it in rain. A dying storm is still carrying an ocean's worth of moisture in its clouds, and when it slows down and wrings that moisture out over saturated ground, people die in freshwater floods far from any coastline. So even the textbook version of Arthur, the boring version where it simply weakens inland, would still be a serious flood threat across the Deep South. Hold that thought, because we are going to come back to those floods, and they are going to be the human face of this entire story. But Arthur is not going to give us the textbook version. That is the whole reason we are here. The models are not showing a storm that cuts its fuel line and quietly fades. They are showing a storm that somehow keeps its engine running over land, that holds its structure across hundreds of miles where it should have nothing left to burn, and that then finds a way to throw fresh fuel back into the fire on the far side of the country. And if the ocean is supposed to be the only fuel a tropical storm can use, then there is only one explanation left standing. Something on land is feeding it. Something is doing the ocean's job. To understand what that something is, we have to talk about an idea that sounds like a contradiction in terms, a concept that turns waterlogged ground into a sea. We have to talk about the brown ocean. Part 3. The brown ocean. The phrase itself is the clue, a brown ocean. We are used to thinking of the ocean as blue, the great warm engine that powers every hurricane. But scientists studying the strange cases where storms survive over land borrowed that word on purpose, because they realized that under the right conditions, the land can behave like a shallow, muddy, brown version of the sea. It can do the ocean's job. It can hand a storm the latent heat it needs to keep its engine running, even with the blue ocean hundreds of miles behind it. The idea has a formal name in the research, the brown ocean effect, and it was laid out and named in work by the scientists Teresa Anderson and Marshall Shepard, who set out to understand how and why some tropical systems refuse to die after they move inland. Let me explain how it actually works, because once you see it, the impossible thing Arthur is about to do starts to make perfect, unsettling sense. Remember the engine. A tropical storm runs on latent heat, the hidden energy carried upward by evaporating moisture. Over the ocean, that moisture comes from the warm sea surface. The brown ocean effect says that under the right conditions, the moisture can come instead from the ground itself, from soil so saturated with water that it evaporates almost like a sea would. Researchers generally point to three conditions that have to be met for this to happen. The first is that the lower part of the atmosphere has to mimic a tropical environment, meaning the temperature barely changes from place to place with very little of the variation you would normally find over land. The second is that the ground has to be extremely wet, soaked with abundant soil moisture, so that there is a vast reservoir of water sitting right at the surface ready to evaporate. And the third condition is the payoff, that saturated ground has to release its moisture upward as latent heat flux, feeding that hidden energy into the storm in a way that imitates what the warm ocean does. When all three line up, the waterlogged land stops acting like a brake and starts acting like a fuel tank. The brown ocean replaces the blue one. Let me make that mechanism as concrete as I can, because it is the strange and beautiful core of this whole story. When the sun beats down on a flooded field, or on ground that has been soaked by days of rain, that water at the surface evaporates, and just like over the ocean, the evaporation carries hidden heat upward into the air. Normally, over dry land, there is not nearly enough moisture in the soil to matter. The ground heats up, but it does not feed the air much water, so a storm passing over it starves. But over ground that has been turned into a shallow reservoir, soaked through and warm, the evaporation can become surprisingly close to what you would get over a warm sea. The land is suddenly handing the storm the same kind of latent heat the ocean did. And the reason this matters so much in summer specifically is that you need warmth and sunlight to drive that evaporation, which is exactly what June provides. A waterlogged south under a high summer sun is, in a very real thermodynamic sense, a sheet of warm, shallow sea laid out across the continent, just brown instead of blue, and a storm crossing it can drink from it the same way. That is not a metaphor I am stretching for effect. It is the literal physical claim the science makes, and it is why a storm's path across saturated ground is the single biggest clue to whether it will survive. Now look at the path Arthur is about to take, and feel the hair on your neck stand up. This storm is not crossing a dry continent. It is crossing the deep south in the middle of a multi-day deluge, ground that is already soaked from days of rain, with more torrential rain falling ahead of the storm and around it. The soil across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle is being turned into exactly the kind of saturated reservoir that the brown ocean effect requires, and the air mass it is moving through is dripping with moisture, tropical and humid from the surface up. The conditions that are supposed to be rare, the conditions that let a storm cheat death over land, are being assembled along Arthur's path like someone is doing it on purpose. This is not a theory waiting for its first example. It has already happened, and the textbook case is so dramatic that it changed how scientists think about inland storms. Go back to 2007 and a system called Tropical Storm Erin. Erin came ashore in Texas as an unremarkable tropical storm and did exactly what the rule says it should. It weakened. The forecasters moved on, and then, roughly 2 days after landfall, far inland over Oklahoma, Erin did something that stunned the people watching. It reorganized. It strengthened. It developed a clearing in the middle that looked, on radar, like an eye. The signature of an intensifying tropical cyclone, except this one was sitting over the dry plains of Oklahoma, nowhere near the sea. It produced damaging winds, it dropped torrential rain, and it behaved for a few hours like a small hurricane that had no business existing where it was. Erin became the poster child for the brown ocean effect, the case that forced meteorologists to take seriously the idea that the ground itself, under the right conditions, can bring a dying storm back to life. When you hold Erin in 2007 next to Arthur today, the pattern is not subtle. A weak tropical storm moving inland over wet ground in a saturated tropical air mass, defying the expectation that it should weaken. That is the recipe. And it tells us that the thing the models are showing for Arthur is not a glitch and not a fantasy. It is a known phenomenon, rare but real, peer-reviewed and physically explained, and the ingredients for it are sitting right there along the storm's track. I want to be honest with you about where the science is certain and where it is not, because that honesty is the whole reason this channel exists. The brown ocean effect is real and documented. That part is not in question. What is genuinely uncertain is how strong the effect will be with Arthur specifically, and whether it produces something as dramatic as Erin's inland eye, or just keeps the storm stubbornly alive as it crosses the south. Forecasting the precise strength of a process this sensitive is extremely hard, so when I tell you Arthur may strengthen over land, I am not promising you an inland hurricane. I am telling you that the mechanism is real, the conditions are present, and the models are leaning into it, and that is more than enough to make this one of the most scientifically interesting storms of the young season. But here is what genuinely gives me pause, and it is the thing I keep circling back to. The brown ocean effect requires saturated ground. It requires an atmosphere loaded with moisture. It requires the lower atmosphere to look tropical across a huge area of land. And every single one of those conditions is a description of an atmosphere that is carrying more water than it used to. The reason Arthur has a brown ocean to feed on is that the Deep South is drowning in moisture this week, and that is not a coincidence floating free of everything else. It is a symptom. It is the same overloaded atmosphere that, 1,000 miles to the north, is about to spin up violent tornadoes on the very same afternoon. The storm refusing to die over land and the tornado outbreak in the Midwest are not two separate stories. They are two symptoms of one condition. And before we can see the whole shape of that condition, we have to follow Arthur all the way to the far side of the country, to the place where a storm that should already be dead is forecast to do the most shocking thing of all. We have to talk about the reload off the Carolinas. Part 4. The reload off the Carolinas. Let us say Arthur does what the brown ocean lets it do. It crosses the coast, it holds together over the soaked ground of the Deep South, it stays alive across Mississippi and Alabama and into Georgia, where the textbook said it should have died. That alone would be a remarkable storm, but it is not the end of the forecast. The models take Arthur all the way to the eastern side of the country, to the Carolinas, and there they show it doing the single most improbable thing in this entire sequence. They show it deepening again, gaining strength, possibly pulling itself back together into a system worthy of tropical storm warnings as it slides off the coast and back over the open Atlantic. A storm reborn, days after it should have been a memory. If the brown ocean explains how Arthur survives the journey, it does not fully explain this final act, because by the time the storm reaches the Carolinas, a second mechanism takes over, and it is a different kind of physics entirely. To see it, you have to look up, far above the storm, to the rivers of fast-moving air that circle the planet in the upper atmosphere. The jet stream. Here is what the models are showing high overhead. As Arthur reaches the eastern seaboard, an accelerated ribbon of jet stream winds is being dragged southward by a larger dip in the atmosphere, a trough, and it positions itself right over the top of the storm. Now, why would fast winds way up at 35,000 feet make a surface storm stronger? The answer is one of the most elegant ideas in all of weather, and it is the key to this whole final act. It is called divergence aloft. Picture the column of air that makes up the storm, from the ground all the way to the top. When that fast jet stream stretches across the top of the column, it acts like a pump pulling air out of the top, evacuating it, scattering it away faster than it can be replaced. We call that dispersal of air at the top divergence aloft, and when you remove air from the top of a column faster than it can be resupplied, the weight of the column drops, which means the pressure at the surface falls. Falling surface pressure is the definition of a strengthening storm. So the jet stream up high acts like a hand reaching down and pulling the storm open from the top, lowering its pressure and inviting more air to rush in at the bottom to take the place of what was removed. Rising air, more thunderstorms, lower pressure, stronger circulation. The engine, which the land was no longer fully feeding, gets jump-started from above. And there is one more ingredient waiting in the Carolinas, because by the time the storm slides off that coast, it is back over water. The warm shelf waters off the southeastern United States are right there, ready to do what the Gulf did at the very beginning, handing the storm real ocean fuel again just as the jet stream is pulling it open from the top. Saturated land kept it alive across the south. The jet stream re-energizes it in the east. The warm Atlantic finishes the job offshore. 3 different mechanisms handed off one to the next like runners in a relay, carrying a storm that should have died days and hundreds of miles ago. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is where the honest science matters most. By the time Arthur is reorganizing off the Carolinas, it may no longer be a purely tropical system in the textbook sense. When the jet stream and an upper-level trough get this involved, a storm often takes on what we call hybrid characteristics, drawing some of its energy from temperature contrasts in the atmosphere rather than purely from ocean heat, behaving partly like the kind of storm we get in winter. So the question of whether it technically keeps the name Arthur, or whether it becomes something forecasters classify differently, is genuinely open. But for anyone living along that coast, the label is almost beside the point. The practical impacts, The wind and the rain and the rough seas would be similar either way. Forecasters were candid about this, openly noting that tropical storm watches or even warnings could become necessary along the Carolina coast by the end of the week if this scenario comes together, while cautioning that nothing about it is locked in. Now step back and notice something the storm is doing long before it ever reaches the Carolinas, because it ties this whole picture together. Even now, with the center still near Texas, the storm is throwing its moisture far out ahead of itself. That upper-level flow we talked about, the winds tearing across the top of the system, is acting like a conveyor belt, exporting tropical moisture downstream, hundreds of miles ahead of the center, into the deep south and toward the eastern seaboard. This is a recognized pattern, sometimes discussed in terms of what meteorologists call a predecessor rain event, where a slug of tropical moisture interacts with a front or a jet far ahead of the storm and produces flooding rain in places the storm's center never even reaches. So Arthur is not just a point on a map crawling along a line. It is the leading edge of a moisture machine that is wetting the ground ahead of it, which feeds the brown ocean that keeps it alive, which delivers it to the jet stream that reloads it. Every part of this storm is setting up the next part. It is, in a strange way, building the road in front of itself as it goes, and that self-feeding quality is what separates Arthur from an ordinary storm in my mind. Most weather systems are passive. They form, they are carried along by the larger flow, they run out of fuel and they die like a leaf floating down a river with no say in where it goes. Arthur is behaving more like something that keeps finding the next handhold. The moisture it throws ahead of itself wets the ground that becomes the brown ocean that keeps it alive long enough to reach the jet stream, that reloads it over the warm water that finishes the job. Every stage sets up the next. I do not want to make it sound like the storm is alive or has intent, because it does not. But the chain of cause and effect is so tightly linked that the effect is the same as if it were chasing its own survival, and that is exactly the kind of behaviour that only becomes possible when the entire surrounding atmosphere is primed to cooperate at every step. A storm can only build the road in front of itself if the ground, the air and the sky are all willing to lay the pavement. This week they are. And that is what makes Arthur such an unsettling thing to watch. It is not behaving like a single event with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is behaving like a system that has found a way to keep finding fuel over water, over land, and over water again, in an atmosphere that seems willing to hand it that fuel at every step. A tropical storm is supposed to be a candle. Light it over warm water, and it burns until the water runs out. Arthur is behaving like a candle that keeps finding new wicks. And the reason it can do that, the reason there is wet ground and loaded air and a diving jet stream all lined up in a row, is that the entire atmosphere over the United States this week is wound up far past its normal state. We have spent this whole time looking at Arthur. Now I need to turn you around and show you the other half of the sky, because the same machine that is keeping this storm alive is at this very moment building something violent over the Midwest. And once you see both at once, the real story finally comes into focus. Part 5. The other half of the same sky. While Arthur is breaking the rules over the Gulf, turn your attention 1,000 miles to the north, because something is happening there today that is, in its own way, just as out of place. Across the Midwest, across Illinois and Indiana, forecasters have drawn a map that does not belong in the middle of June. It is a map that belongs to April, and the people who make these forecasts for a living are using language they normally say for the worst days of the spring. Let me give you the picture in plain terms. The Storm Prediction Center, the office responsible for warning the country about severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, has placed parts of Illinois and Indiana under a level 4 out of 5 risk of severe weather for this afternoon and evening. 4 out of 5. That is a category they do not hand out casually. Around that bullseye sits a larger level 3 zone, and around that a level 2 stretching across several states. But it is the heart of it, centered over central Illinois near Springfield and Peoria, and reaching into northwest Indiana, that has forecasters genuinely worried. Their own summary of the day uses words that should make anyone pay attention. Intense tornadoes, swaths of damaging winds over 75 miles an hour, damaging, wind-driven large hail, all of it possible in a single afternoon. Dig into the specifics and it gets more serious, not less. There is a 15% hatched tornado area on the map, and that word hatched is the part that matters. It is the forecaster's specific way of telling you they see the potential for violent tornadoes, the strong end of the scale, the kind rated EF3 or higher, the kind that levels well-built homes. A tornado watch has already been issued and is in effect. There is a 30% hatched wind area warning of the potential for gusts to hurricane force, 75 miles an hour and beyond, the kind of straight-line wind that can do as much damage to a house as a weak tornado. And there is a hail threat that forecasters describe as significant. Hailstones potentially exceeding 2 inches across, which is to say hail the size of baseballs, falling fast enough to shatter windshields and punch holes in roofs. Now here is the part that connects this back to everything we have been talking about, the part that tells you this is not just a bad weather day, but an out-of-place one. The reason all of this is on the table is a single anomalous feature, a deep low-pressure system tracking into the Great Lakes that is far stronger than anything we would expect in the middle of June. The forecast data has it dropping toward around 990 millibars, a depth of low pressure that this far south, this time of year, is the kind of thing that shows up maybe once in a decade, if that. Riding with that deep low is a jet stream that is frankly shocking for mid-June, with winds high in the atmosphere running at speeds we associate with late winter, not the doorstep of summer. The numbers underneath the forecast, the measures of how much the atmosphere can spin and how much energy it has to work with, are spiking into ranges that flatly tell the forecasters the atmosphere is loaded. If you want a sense of just how unusual this is, listen to how the forecasters themselves are framing it. They are pointing out that we normally see this caliber of dynamic setup in the depths of winter or at the peak of spring storm season, not in June. One way to think about it is that the calendar says early summer, but the machinery overhead is running a springtime program, the kind of clash of forces that produces the worst tornado outbreaks in American history. There is even a historical comparison being made to a notorious June outbreak years ago in Minnesota that produced multiple violent tornadoes in a single afternoon, except that event was farther north, where such things are slightly less rare, and this one is setting up with dynamics that in some ways look even more intense, in a place and at a time it simply should not. We actually talked about this exact setup in our video yesterday, when this was still a forecast, still hours away, still building. At that point, the question was whether the pieces would come together. Today they are coming together in real time, with a tornado watch already out and storms already firing. So I am not going to spend this whole video reforecasting an outbreak we already broke down. What I want you to take from it is something bigger than the outbreak itself, and it is this. The same calendar page that has a violent, April-grade tornado threat unfolding over Illinois also has a tropical storm breaking the laws of hurricane science over the Gulf. Two completely different kinds of disaster, two completely different regions, the same single day. And when you see two things that strange happening at the same time, the scientific question is not what are the odds. The scientific question is whether they are really two things at all, or whether they are two faces of one larger thing. Because an atmosphere does not usually produce a once-a-decade June low and a rule-breaking inland tropical storm on the same afternoon by coincidence. Something has to be connecting them, and it turns out something is, one enormous pattern wrapped across the entire country, with the Midwest outbreak on one side of it and Arthur on the other. So let me show you the machine that is running both. Part 6. One pattern, two faces. Here is the idea I want to plant in your mind, because once it is there, you will never look at a weather map the same way again. The tornado outbreak in the Midwest and the rule-breaking storm over the Gulf are not neighbors who happen to live on the same street. They are powered by the same engine. They are the left hand and the right hand of one enormous continent-spanning pattern, and that pattern is the real subject of this entire video. Arthur is not the story. Arthur is a symptom. The outbreak is not the story either. It is another symptom. The story is the condition of the atmosphere that is producing both. Let me connect the wiring for you piece by piece. Remember the deep low-pressure system tracking into the Great Lakes, the once-a-decade June low driving the tornado threat. A low that deep does not just spin up storms directly underneath it. It reorganizes the flow of the entire atmosphere around it for 1,000 miles in every direction. On its eastern and southern flanks, a system like that pulls air northward from the south in a powerful surge, dragging warm, wet air up from the Gulf of Mexico into the middle of the country. That northward surge of Gulf moisture is part of what is fueling the violent storms in Illinois and Indiana. The same deep low is also what sharpens and accelerates the jet stream, the ribbon of fast upper-level wind that is giving those Midwest storms the spin and the energy to become tornadic. Now follow that same machinery south, toward Arthur, and watch the connections light up. That northward surge of moisture pulling up from the Gulf is the same moist conveyor that is loading the deep south with the saturated air and soaked ground that Arthur needs for its brown ocean. The trough digging into the country, the same large-scale dip in the atmosphere associated with that deep low and the jet stream, is the very feature that the models show diving south later in the week and reaching over the top of Arthur as it approaches the Carolinas, providing the divergence aloft that reloads the storm. Do you see what is happening? The exact same atmospheric setup that is spinning up tornadoes in the Midwest today is the setup that is feeding Arthur its moisture now, and that will hand it its second life on the East Coast in a few days. One pattern, two faces. The tornado outbreak and the impossible storm are drinking from the same well. I want to slow down on this connection because it is so easy to miss and so important to see. If you only watched the Midwest coverage today, you would come away thinking the story was tornadoes, full stop. If you only watched the Gulf coverage, you would think the story was a tropical storm, full stop. Neither would be wrong exactly, but both would be missing the larger truth that they are the same weather system seen from 2,000 miles apart. The deep low and its jet stream are like a single set of gears, and the tornadoes and the tropical storm are like two different machines bolted to those same gears, doing different jobs but turning in time with each other. When the gears speed up, both machines run harder. That is why the timing lines up so precisely, the outbreak and the rule-breaking storm peaking on the same calendar page. It is not that two bad things happen to coincide. It is that one big thing is happening, and these are two of the places where you can see it. This is the thing this channel is built to notice, the connection that most coverage misses because it treats every storm as its own separate news item. The Midwest gets a tornado segment, the Gulf gets a tropical segment, and nobody steps back far enough to see that they are the same system breathing in two places at once. But when you do step back, the picture that emerges is genuinely sobering, and it brings us right back to the thread that has been running underneath everything. Why is Arthur refusing to die? Because the atmosphere is so loaded with energy and moisture this week that it is handing fuel to storms everywhere it can, over the soaked ground of the south, in the violent updrafts of the Midwest, in the diving jet stream overhead. The same overload that makes a June tornado outbreak possible is what makes a rule-breaking inland storm possible. They are not two coincidences. They are one condition with two symptoms, and by Thursday, the reach of this single pattern becomes almost hard to believe. As the cold front associated with that deep low sweeps eastward, the severe weather threat does not end. It marches into the mid-Atlantic and the northeast, with forecasters watching a long corridor from Kentucky up through the major cities of the eastern seaboard for damaging winds, even raising the possibility of a long-lived, fast-moving windstorm. At the same time, Arthur's remnants and moisture are spreading flooding rain across the southeast. Add it all up across those days and you get more than 120 million people, well over a third of the country, under some kind of severe weather threat from a single, connected pattern. One machine. A continent of consequences. So when someone asks you what is going on with the weather this week, the honest answer is not a list. It is not tornadoes in the Midwest, and separately a storm in the Gulf, and separately flooding in the south, and separately wind in the northeast. The honest answer is that one enormous overloaded pattern has set up across the United States, and these are the different ways it is expressing itself in different places. Arthur is the part of that pattern that happens to be breaking a famous rule, which is why it is our headline. But it is the pattern, not the storm, that should hold your attention. Which raises the obvious and uncomfortable question. Why is the atmosphere this overloaded in the first place? Why is there this much moisture, this much energy, this early in the year, enough to feed a tornado outbreak and an undying storm on the same day? To answer that, we have to go back to where Arthur was born, and we have to look at the water it came from. We have to talk about the Gulf, and about an ocean that this year simply will not cool down. Part 7. A Gulf that will not cool down. Every story in this video begins in the same place, the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico. That is where Arthur was born. That is where the moisture surging north into the Midwest outbreak is coming from. That is the reservoir the entire overloaded pattern is drawing on, So if we want to understand why the atmosphere is breaking rules this week, we have to understand the state of that water, and the state of that water this year is, in a word, hot. Let me set the backdrop because it explains the timing of everything. We are in the middle of June, only days into the official Atlantic hurricane season, and we already have our first named storm. That alone is worth a pause. The season does not even formally begin until the 1st of June, and historically the first named storm often does not arrive until well into the summer. To have Arthur spinning up over the Gulf this early is a sign that the basin is primed and ready far ahead of schedule. A storm needs warm water to form, and the fact that the Gulf is already handing out tropical storms tells you the fuel tank is full when it would normally still be filling. There is a larger climate signal sitting behind this, and it has a name you have heard before, the El Niño and La Niña cycle, what scientists call ENSO. Right now, the Pacific is in what gets described as a neutral but warming state. The headline number that forecasters track, an index of how warm or cool the key part of the Pacific is, sits at around plus 0.48, and crucially it has been climbing, rising out of cooler conditions late last year, and trending warmer through the spring. We covered this in detail in our recent videos on the El Niño data, and the reason it matters here is that the state of the Pacific helps set the table for the entire pattern over North America, nudging the jet stream, influencing where storms form, and contributing to the broad warmth that has the Gulf running hot this early. But the number that matters most for Arthur is simpler and more direct. The sea surface across the northwestern Gulf is warm enough and through enough depth to support a tropical system in the middle of June, warm enough to keep evaporating moisture into the air faster than the atmosphere can carry it away. That warm water is the original source of everything. It is the latent heat in Arthur's clouds. It is the moisture being thrown out ahead of the storm to soak the ground. It is the saturated air that will let the brown ocean effect work as Arthur crosses land. Trace any thread of this week's weather back far enough, and you arrive at the same warm sea. And the Gulf is a particularly dangerous place for this kind of early warmth, because of something we touched on with the engine. It is not just how warm the surface is, it is how far down the warmth goes. The Gulf is a relatively enclosed shallow basin compared to the open ocean, and when it heats up, it can heat up through a meaningful depth and hold that heat stubbornly. That matters because a storm churns the water beneath it, dragging up whatever is below, over a thin layer of warm water on top of cold, that churning quickly cools the surface and starves the storm. But over a Gulf that is warm well below the surface, the churning just brings up more warm water, and the fuel keeps flowing. A warm Gulf this early in the year is not only a fuller fuel tank, it is a fuel tank that resists being emptied, which is exactly the condition that lets a storm hold its strength longer and recover faster. So when I say the Gulf is running hot this June, I do not just mean the beaches feel warm. I mean the basin is storing energy in a way that makes everything downstream, the early formation, the resilience over land, the flood-loading moisture, more possible at once. The warm sea is not just where Arthur started, it is the reason every strange thing Arthur is about to do has the fuel it needs to happen. Now I want to be careful and honest because this is exactly the kind of place where it is easy to overreach. I am not going to stand here and tell you that this single storm proves any one thing about the long-term future. One storm is weather, not climate. But I can tell you what the scientists who study this are genuinely debating, and it is a real and open question, not a settled slogan. They are asking whether a warmer Gulf and a moisture-loaded atmosphere are shifting the odds, making it more likely that we see storms forming earlier, carrying more water, and showing more resilience over land than they used to. That is not a claim that this storm was caused by anything. It is a question about whether the dice are being loaded, and it is being asked in peer-reviewed journals by serious people, and the honest answer right now is that it is an area of active research rather than a closed case. What is not in doubt is the immediate physics. A warmer ocean evaporates more moisture. More moisture in the air means more fuel available to every storm that comes along, more latent heat to release, more water to wring out as rain. And a Gulf that is this warm this early is an atmosphere that has been handed a larger fuel supply than usual, at a time of year when storms are just getting started. That is the deeper reason Arthur has a brown ocean to feed on, and the reason the Midwest has a moisture surge to spin into tornadoes. The warm water is upstream of all of it, and here is the thought that I cannot shake. the one that ties the warm Gulf back to the central mystery of this whole storm. If the first storm of the season is already breaking the rule that land kills hurricanes, and it can do that because the Gulf is this warm and the air is this loaded in the middle of June, then what does the rest of the season look like? We have 3, nearly 4 more months of hurricane season ahead of us, the part of the calendar when the water normally reaches its hottest and the biggest storms historically form. Arthur is the opening act, and the opening act is already doing something the textbook says should not be possible. That should make you very curious and maybe a little uneasy about what the main event looks like. But to really understand why this atmosphere is so overloaded, why there is this much water available to feed storms over water and over land alike, we have to get specific about a piece of physics that governs how much moisture the sky can hold in the first place. It is one of the most reliable rules in all of science, and right now it is the reason the air over the south is carrying almost as much water as it physically can. Let me show you the law of a thirstier sky. Part 8. The physics of a thirstier sky. There is a number buried in this week's data that does not look dramatic at first, but it might be the most important number of all, because it explains why the rain totals we're about to talk about are so extreme. Forecasters measure something called precipitable water, which is a way of asking a simple question. If you took all the water vapour in a column of the atmosphere from the ground to the top and squeezed every bit of it out as rain, how many inches would you get? It is, in effect, a fuel gauge for the sky. And ahead of Arthur, that gauge is reading somewhere between 2.1 and 2.6 inches, which is near record levels for the middle of June. Let me translate what that means, because it is the difference between an ordinary rainstorm and a flood. When the atmosphere is carrying that much moisture, every thunderstorm that forms has an enormous reservoir to draw on. The storms are not rationing water. They are pulling from a sky that is nearly as full of moisture as it can physically be for this time of year, and they are dumping it out at rates that overwhelm the ground. That single number, the precipitable water reading, is why the flood threat with this system is so serious, and it is why the brown ocean effect has a chance to work, because that loaded air is the same air that keeps the lower atmosphere looking tropical as Arthur crosses land. So why is the sky this thirsty? This is where one of the most dependable laws in physics comes in, and it has an intimidating name, the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, but the idea behind it is simple enough to hold in your hand. Warmer air can hold more water vapour than cooler air, not a little more, substantially more. The rule of thumb that scientists use is that for every 1 degree Celsius the air warms, it can hold roughly 7% more moisture. 7% per degree. That number sounds modest until you start stacking it up, because it compounds and it applies to the entire atmosphere everywhere at once. Think about what that means in practice. A warmer atmosphere is not just a hotter version of the same sky, it is a fundamentally thirstier sky, one with a larger capacity to soak up water from warm oceans and then carry it inland and rain it out. When the Gulf is running warm and the air above it is running warm, that air can load itself with more moisture than it could have in a cooler world, and then a storm comes along and converts all that extra moisture into extra rain, extra latent heat, extra fuel. The 7% rule is quiet, but it is relentless, and it is sitting underneath the near-record precipitable water values feeding this exact event. Here is a way to feel what that rule does in practice. Imagine 2 versions of the exact same storm, with the exact same winds and structure, one moving through air that is slightly cooler and one moving through air that is slightly warmer. The warmer one is carrying more water vapour for no other reason than that warmer air can hold it. When both storms wring out their moisture, the warmer one drops more rain, not a little more but meaningfully more, and it does it everywhere it goes, over every town along its path. Now stretch that across an entire loaded atmosphere over an entire region, and you can see how a modest shift in baseline warmth turns ordinary rainstorms into flooding rainstorms and flooding rainstorms into the kind that break records. The atmosphere does not announce this. There is no dramatic moment where you can see the extra moisture. It is just quietly there, in every cubic mile of air, raising the ceiling on how much water can fall. And that quiet, invisible ceiling is exactly why a near-record precipitable water reading should grab a forecaster's attention more than almost any other single number, because it tells you the sky is loaded to fire. Now connect that back to the brown ocean. because this is where two ideas we have already covered click together into something bigger. The brown ocean effect needs the lower atmosphere to look tropical, and the air to stay loaded with moisture as a storm moves inland. A thirstier sky, holding more water vapour, makes those conditions easier to achieve and easier to sustain over land. In other words, the same physics that loads the atmosphere with flood-producing moisture is the physics that makes it more possible for a storm to keep its engine running where it used to stall. The thirsty sky and the undying storm are the same phenomenon seen from two angles. More moisture in the air means more rain, more fuel, and more resilience for storms that should be dying. It is all one system. I want to keep being precise about what I am and am not claiming, because the discipline matters. The Clausius-Clapeyron relationship is not controversial. It is textbook physics, demonstrated in a laboratory, as solid as anything in science. What scientists are still working out is exactly how all of that extra available moisture translates into specific storms in specific places, because the atmosphere is fiendishly complicated, and moisture is only one ingredient among many. So I am not going to tell you the 7% rule by itself, explains Arthur. I am telling you it is part of why the sky over the south is this loaded right now, and a loaded sky is the precondition for everything strange that is happening this week, from the rule-breaking storm to the violent outbreak to the floods that are coming. And the floods are coming. We have spent a lot of time on the physics of why Arthur refuses to die, on the brown ocean, and the jet stream, and the thirsty sky, because that is the genuinely fascinating science at the heart of this storm. But physics is not what hurts people. Water is what hurts people. All of this loaded moisture, all of this fuel, all of this rule-breaking resilience has a consequence on the ground, and that consequence is measured in inches of rain over saturated soil and feet of water rising into places people live. So let me bring this back down to earth, literally, and show you what a rule-breaking, moisture-loaded storm actually does to the people in its path. Part 9. The water is the weapon. If you remember nothing else about Arthur, remember this. The danger from this storm is not the wind, it is the water. The winds will be modest, gusts of 40 to 50 miles an hour near the coast, enough to knock down a few branches and rattle the windows, but not the thing that hurts people. The thing that hurts people is the rain, and the reason a weak storm can be so dangerous is precisely the loaded atmosphere we just spent all that time explaining. A thirsty sky carrying near-record moisture, wrung out over ground that is already soaked, is a recipe for the kind of flooding that fills the news for the wrong reasons. Let me give you the numbers, because they are serious. The Weather Prediction Centre, the office responsible for forecasting heavy rain and flooding, has placed a large area of the Gulf states under a moderate risk of excessive rainfall, which on their scale is a level 3 out of 4. That is not a routine designation. They are forecasting widespread totals of 2 to 5 inches across a broad swath of the south, and within that, localised amounts of 6 to 9 inches in the hardest hit areas, particularly across southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, and parts of southern Mississippi. Some of the model guidance pushes even higher in isolated spots. When you drop 6, 7, 8 inches of rain onto ground that is already saturated, the water has nowhere to go. It does not soak in, it runs off into creeks and streets and low-lying neighbourhoods, and it rises fast. There is also a coastal piece to this. Along the immediate Texas and Louisiana coast, forecasters are warning of a storm surge of 2 to 4 feet around the times of high tide, with coastal flood warnings and advisories already posted. That surge is not catastrophic on its own, but it does something dangerous when you combine it with the rainfall. When the sea is pushed up against the coast at the same moment that rivers and bayous are trying to drain all that runoff out to that same sea, the water backs up. The drainage stalls, and the flooding inland gets worse because the water simply has nowhere to escape to. It is the combination, the surge meeting the runoff, that turns a heavy rain event into a genuine flood emergency along the coast. Now here is where the science we covered comes back to bite. Remember that even before Arthur's centre makes its closest approach, the storm is throwing its moisture far out ahead of itself, that conveyor belt of tropical air being exported downstream. That means the flooding threat is not confined to wherever the centre happens to track. Rain can fall, and fall heavily, in places well ahead of and well to the side of the storm's path, in that predecessor pattern we talked about, where tropical moisture interacts with a front or the jet stream, far from the centre, and produces flooding rain on its own. So a town that looks at the forecast cone and says the centre is not coming near us, we are fine, may still find itself under 6 inches of rain. The cone shows where the centre goes. It does not show where the water goes, and the water goes much, much farther. This is the most dangerous misconception about a storm like Arthur, and I want to hammer it because it kills people every year. When a tropical system is weak or weakening, or sloppy and disorganized, people relax. They see a tropical storm instead of a hurricane, they see it falling apart on radar, and they conclude it is not a serious threat. But the historical record is brutally clear on this point. Some of the deadliest tropical disasters in American history were not powerful hurricanes. They were weak, slow, rain-heavy systems that parked over an area and drowned it. The water does not check the category before it rises. A dying storm carrying an ocean's worth of moisture, moving slowly over saturated ground, is one of the most dangerous things in weather, precisely because nobody is afraid of it. The historical record drives this home in a way the statistics alone cannot. Over and over, the storms that have killed the most people inland were not the famous, powerful hurricanes that everyone evacuated for. They were the weakened, sloppy, downgraded systems that nobody took seriously, that stalled over a region and rained until the rivers came up and the hillsides let go. People drowned in their cars on roads that looked passable, in basements and low-lying neighbourhoods far from any coast, days after the storm had supposedly fallen apart. The pattern repeats because the human response repeats. The category drops, the fear drops with it, the warnings get tuned out, and then the water rises anyway, indifferent to what we called the storm. With Arthur, the brown ocean effect makes this worse in a specific way, because it keeps the storm producing rain for longer, over more ground than a normal weakening system would, stretching out the very window of false calm in which people let their guard down. The storm staying alive and the danger staying alive are once again the exact same fact. And Arthur, remember, is not even going to weaken on schedule. That is the whole story. The brown ocean effect that keeps its engine running over land is also what keeps its rain machine running over land. A storm that holds together longer is a storm that keeps producing heavy rain longer, over more ground as it crawls across the south. The same resilience that makes Arthur scientifically fascinating is what makes its flood threat more prolonged than a normal inland storm. The rule breaking and the danger are the same fact wearing 2 different coats. So if you live anywhere from the upper Texas coast across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, and into Georgia and the Carolinas as the week goes on, the message is simple. Do not watch the wind, watch the water. Know whether you live in a low-lying or flood-prone area. Never, ever drive into water across a road, because it takes a shocking small depth of moving water to float a vehicle, and the majority of flood deaths happen in cars. The storm that is breaking the laws of physics over your head is going to express that rule breaking for most people as simply too much rain falling for too long on ground that cannot take any more. But rain is not the only weapon a storm like this carries. There is a second hazard, quieter, more hidden, and in some ways more frightening because of when and how it strikes. Tropical systems like Arthur have a habit of hiding tornadoes inside their rain bands, spin-up tornadoes that form fast, give almost no warning, and often come in the dark. So before we step back to look at the whole strange picture one last time, let me show you the tornadoes hiding in Arthur's rain. Part 10. The tornadoes hiding in the rain. There is a particular kind of tornado that tropical systems produce, and it is one of the most insidious threats in all of weather, because almost nothing about it matches what people expect a tornado to be. When most of us picture a tornado, we picture the Great Plains, a dark sky, a clearly visible funnel snaking down from a towering supercell that you can see coming for miles. The tornadoes that storms like Arthur spawn are nothing like that. They are small, they are fast, they are wrapped in rain so you cannot see them, and they drop out of the sky with almost no warning at all. Let me explain why they happen, because the physics is its own small piece of the puzzle. A tropical system, even a weak one, drags a tremendous amount of spin into the lower atmosphere, and it carries strong changes in wind speed and direction with height, what meteorologists call wind shear, especially on its eastern and northeastern side. When the bands of thunderstorms rotating around the storm move over land, that low-level spin and shear can get concentrated into small, quick circulations inside individual cells. They do not need the enormous organized supercell structure that plains tornadoes require. They just need the storm's own embedded rotation and a little bit of instability, and they can spin up in minutes. That is why they're called spin-up tornadoes. They are born fast, and they die fast. But in the few minutes they exist, they can do real damage. For Arthur, the forecasters have flagged exactly this threat across the Deep South. A marginal risk of severe weather, with a tornado threat running along the eastern side of the system, as it comes ashore and moves inland, from Louisiana across Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, Georgia, and eventually towards South Carolina. The probabilities look low on paper, a couple of %, with forecasters noting the possibility of nudging that higher as the system structure becomes clearer. But here is the thing about tropical tornadoes that the percentages do not capture. These systems can produce them in bunches. There is a long history of weak, unimpressive tropical storms spinning up not one or two tornadoes but a half-dozen, a dozen, sometimes more, scattered across the days the storm takes to cross the land. Individually, each one is usually on the weaker end of the scale. Collectively, they add up to a real and prolonged threat, and then there is the timing, which is the part that genuinely worries me. The peak of the tornado threat with these tropical systems often comes overnight, and in the pre-dawn hours, when the rain bands are sweeping through and people are asleep. A tornado you cannot see, wrapped in rain, in the dark while you're in bed, is about the most dangerous configuration weather can produce. Because the single most important thing in surviving a tornado is getting the warning and acting on it, and that is exactly what is hardest to do at 3 a.m. This is why, if you are anywhere in that corridor across the Deep South over the next couple of days, the advice is so specific. Make sure you have a way to get warnings that will wake you up. Not an app that is silenced overnight. Something loud enough to pull you out of sleep, because the warning-led time on these spin-ups is measured in minutes, not the longer cushion you sometimes get with a classic plain supercell. Notice too how this hazard ties straight back to the central thread. The spin-up tornadoes are not a separate storm. They are another expression of the same embedded energy that the warm Gulf loaded into this system, the same rotation and moisture and instability that the loaded atmosphere is handing out everywhere this week. The Midwest is getting violent, visible, long-track tornadoes from the organized supercells of that once-a-decade low. The Deep South is getting brief, hidden, rain-wrapped tornadoes from Arthur's bands. Different mechanisms, different appearances, but the same overloaded atmosphere underneath both, expressing its excess energy in whatever form the local conditions allow. One sky, finding every possible way to spin. So now we have the full inventory of what this rule-breaking storm is actually doing. It is surviving over land on a brown ocean of saturated soil. It is poised to reload off the Carolinas under a diving jet stream. It is dumping flooding rain far ahead of its own center, and it is hiding tornadoes in its rain bands as it goes. Every one of those is a symptom of the same loaded sky. But whenever a storm behaves this strangely, whenever it seems to defy the rules everyone thought they understood, something else always happens alongside it. Something that has nothing to do with the atmosphere and everything to do with us. People start looking for someone to blame, and so before we land this, I want to take on, honestly and head-on, the theories that are already circulating about why this storm is doing the impossible, because separating what is real from what is not is the entire reason this channel exists. Part 11. When a storm breaks the rules, so do the theories. Whenever a storm does something that looks impossible, a second storm forms right behind it, made not of wind and rain, but of suspicion. And I understand why. When you are told your whole life that land kills hurricanes, and then you watch a storm strengthen over land, and then watch it come back to life off a coast hundreds of miles from where it started, a very human part of your brain says, that is not natural. Someone must be doing this. And so, already, with Arthur barely named, the theories are circulating, that the storm is being steered, that it is being artificially strengthened, that some program or some technology is pulling the strings, making it behave in ways nature would not allow. I am not going to mock anyone for feeling that way, because the feeling comes from a real and reasonable instinct, the sense that something is violating the rules. I am just going to walk through calmly what the science actually says. Let me start with the most important point. and it is the one we have spent this entire video building toward. The reason Arthur looks like it is breaking the rules is not that someone is breaking them for it. It is that the simple rule most people carry in their head, land kills hurricanes, is an incomplete version of the real science. The complete version includes the brown ocean effect, where saturated ground feeds a storm-latent heat the way the ocean does. It includes divergence aloft, where a diving jet stream pulls a storm open from the top and lowers its pressure. It includes the warm shelf waters offshore that hand a storm real ocean fuel again. None of that requires a single human being to do anything. It is all documented, peer-reviewed, physically explained atmospheric science. The storm feels rule-breaking only because the rule you were taught was the cartoon version. The full picture has room for everything Arthur is doing. Now let me deal directly with the idea that this storm could be deliberately steered or strengthened by technology, because it is worth taking seriously enough to actually answer rather than wave away. The honest response comes down to energy, and the scale of it is almost impossible to wrap your head around. A tropical storm, even a modest one like Arthur, is releasing energy on a scale that dwarfs anything human beings can produce on purpose. The latent heat being released inside a single tropical system, hour after hour, is comparable to the output of the entire world's power generation many times over, or the energy of a string of the largest weapons ever built, going off continuously. Every serious analysis of the technologies people point to, the radio and ionospheric research facilities, the cloud seeding programs, all of them, finds the same thing. The energy they can put into the atmosphere is smaller than the energy of a storm by something like a factor of billions. You cannot steer a freight train by breathing on it, and you cannot redirect or fuel a hurricane with technology that operates billions of times below the scale of the storm itself. The numbers simply do not allow it. So when a storm strengthens over land, the explanation is not a hidden hand. It is wet soil and a diving jet stream, exactly the mechanisms we have spent this whole video laying out. The value in addressing the conspiracy is not to scold anyone. It is to point out that the truth is actually more interesting than the theory. The idea that some agency is steering Arthur is, in a strange way, less remarkable than what is really happening, which is that the natural atmosphere, all on its own, has assembled the precise conditions to let a storm cheat death. Reality did not need any help to be astonishing this week, but I do not want to leave you with the impression that there is nothing here worth questioning, because there is, and intellectual honesty cuts both ways. There is a real scientific debate sitting underneath all of this, and it is not about steering storms, it is about loading dice. The genuine, open, actively researched question is whether a warmer Gulf and a moisture-loaded atmosphere are shifting the odds over time, making storms that form earlier, carry more water, and resist dying over land more common than they used to be. That is not a fringe idea. That is a question being asked in serious journals by serious scientists, and the honest answer is that it is an area of active investigation, not a settled verdict. Notice the difference. The conspiracy says someone is reaching into the system and breaking the rules on purpose. The real scientific question asks whether the background conditions of the whole system are slowly changing, in a way that makes rule-breaking storms more likely on their own. One is a story about a puppeteer. The other is a story about the stage itself shifting under everyone's feet. The second one is harder to picture, less satisfying as a villain, and far more supported by the evidence. That is the discipline this channel tries to hold. We do not promote theories as fact. We do not pretend that everything strange has a sinister explanation, but we also do not dismiss the real questions just because some of the questions around them are unfounded. Arthur is not being controlled, but Arthur may be telling us something true about the state of the atmosphere it was born into, and that is worth paying very close attention to. And to be completely clear about what kind of event this is, I want to take one more thing off the table, because I know some of you are wondering about it. There is a whole family of ideas that tries to connect strange weather to activity on the sun, to solar storms and space weather. So let me show you what the sun is actually doing this week, because the answer rules out an entire category of explanation and tells us exactly where to keep our attention. Part 12. The Quiet Sky and the Pattern That Won't Quit. If you have followed this channel for a while, you know that a huge part of what we cover is the sun, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, geomagnetic storms, the constant question of what the space environment around Earth is doing to us. So it would be reasonable to wonder whether any of this week's wild weather has a connection to the sun. And the answer, this week, is refreshingly simple: no. And the reason that matters is that it tells us exactly where the action is, and it is not overhead in space. It is down here, in the air and the water. Let me give you the state of the sun right now, because the contrast with the weather is almost funny. Space weather this week is about as quiet as it gets. The index that measures geomagnetic disturbance, the thing that spikes during a solar storm, is sitting at low values, well below storm levels. There are no Earth-directed coronal mass ejections barreling toward us. The sun has produced only minor low-level flares. The solar wind is running close to ordinary. By every measure we normally track, the space environment is calm. If you were waiting for a solar storm to blame for the chaos in the atmosphere, there isn't one. The sun is sitting this one out entirely. I point this out not just to rule out a theory, but because it sharpens the whole picture. This week is a purely atmospheric and oceanic story. There is no cosmic trigger, no solar culprit, no space weather component hiding in the background. Everything strange that is happening, the rule-breaking storm, the violent outbreak, the floods, is being generated entirely by the Earth's own atmosphere and oceans, by warm water and loaded air and a contorted jet stream. And in a way that is more sobering than a solar storm would be, because a solar storm is something that happens to us from the outside. This is the system we live inside doing this on its own. So with the sun ruled out, keep your eyes where they belong, on a pattern that frankly refuses to quit. Because Arthur and the Midwest outbreak are not the end of this, they are the middle of it. As the days go on, the same overloaded setup keeps finding new ways to express itself. By Thursday, as the cold front sweeps east, the severe weather threat shifts into the mid-Atlantic and the northeast, with forecasters watching a long corridor of major cities for damaging winds, even discussing the possibility of a fast-moving, long-lived windstorm punching across densely populated areas. At the same time, the flooding threat from Arthur's moisture spreads across the southeast, and the heavy rain just keeps adding up on already saturated ground. And it does not stop there. Looking toward the weekend, a brand new severe weather threat is already taking shape over the Central Plains for Saturday, with a fresh disturbance ejecting out of the Rockies and pulling yet more moisture northward. By Sunday and Monday, that threat looks to shift into the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, going over much of the same ground that is getting hit today. The phrase that keeps coming to mind, the one the forecasters themselves keep reaching for, is that the atmosphere seems stuck on repeat. The same loaded pattern keeps reloading, keeps firing, keeps finding new regions to threaten, day after day after day. That persistence is itself part of the story, and it ties straight back to the central thread. A single rule-breaking storm could be a fluke. A single out-of-season outbreak could be bad luck. But a pattern that keeps generating extreme event after extreme event across region after region for the better part of a week and more is not a fluke. It is a sign of an atmosphere carrying so much energy and so much moisture that it cannot discharge it all at once, so it keeps going, finding outlet after outlet. Arthur refusing to die over land and the calendar refusing to give the country a quiet day are the same fact at different scales. One storm that will not quit, inside one pattern that will not quit. So here we are, with the full picture finally in front of us. A storm breaking the oldest rule in hurricane science, an outbreak that belongs to April erupting in June, floods spreading across the south, wind threatening the northeast, a weekend reload already on the way, the sun for once completely innocent, and underneath all of it, one overloaded atmosphere expressing itself in every form it can find. The only question left is the biggest one, the one that has been waiting at the end of this whole story from the moment Arthur refused to fall apart. If this is what the first storm of the season looks like, what does it mean? So let me bring it all the way home. Part 13. The Opening Act. Let me put Arthur in its place on the calendar, because that placement is the whole reason this storm should stay in your mind long after the rain has stopped. We are in the middle of June. The Atlantic hurricane season officially began only at the start of the month. By the rhythms of a normal year, this is the quiet overture, the part of the season when the ocean is still warming up, when forecasters are watching but not yet worried, when the first named storm is often weeks away from forming. This is supposed to be the slow part, and in this slow part, on this early date, the season's very first storm has already done something that most storms never do in their entire lives. It has broken the rule that land kills hurricanes. Think about that as an opening act. When the first storm of the year is already cheating death over land and reloading off a distant coast, you have to ask what it is telling you about the stage it walked onto. And the answer is the warm Gulf, the loaded atmosphere, the thirsty sky we spent this whole video describing. Arthur did not break the rules through some special property of its own. It is, by the numbers, a weak and unremarkable storm. It broke the rules because the environment it formed in handed it everything it needed to. The storm is ordinary, the environment is not, and that is the unsettling part because the environment is not going anywhere. It is the same environment that the next storm will form in, and the one after that. We have 3, nearly 4 more months of this season ahead of us, and the part of the season still to come, late summer into the fall, is historically when the ocean reaches its warmest and the largest, most dangerous storms have always formed. So here is the honest framing of the question, and I want to be careful to ask it as a question and not dress it up as a prediction. If the warm-up act, in the supposedly quiet part of the year, is already a storm that defies the textbook, what happens when the basin reaches its peak heat and the atmosphere is at its most loaded? Are we looking at a season where the kind of behaviour that used to be the exception starts showing up as the baseline? I want to be very clear about the limits of what I am saying, because this is exactly the place where it would be easy to slip from science into scaremongering, and I will not do that to you. One storm is not a season. Arthur breaking the rules in June does not guarantee anything about August or September. The atmosphere is complicated, and any given storm depends on a dozen ingredients lining up, not just warm water. So I am not telling you this season is going to be a catastrophe. Nobody can tell you that, and anyone who claims certainty is selling something. What I am telling you is that the conditions that let Arthur do the impossible are the same conditions that have been building for a while now, and they are present early, and they are present strongly, and that is genuine reason to pay attention as the season unfolds. And this connects to a question that scientists are actually wrestling with, the serious version of the question, not the conspiracy version. The real debate is about whether we are crossing into a different operating regime, one where the warm oceans and the loaded atmosphere shift the whole range of what is normal, so that storms forming earlier, holding together longer, carrying more water, and resisting the death that land used to guarantee become steadily more common. Not because anyone is steering them, because the background state of the system is changing. That is the question Arthur raises quietly, by simply refusing to behave the way the textbook said it would. It is a small storm asking a very large question, so when you watch Arthur crawl across the south over the next few days, holding together where it should fall apart, I want you to see it as more than one odd storm. See it as the opening line of a season, a single sentence that hints at the shape of the whole story to come. We do not know yet how that story ends, but the first line is already strange enough that everyone who studies this is leaning in to read the next one. And to really understand what we are reading, we need to step all the way back and take in the whole sky at once, because the full picture is bigger than Arthur, bigger than the outbreak, bigger than any single piece we have looked at so far. Part 14. Reading the Whole Sky. I want to do something now that almost no weather coverage ever does, which is to refuse to break this week into separate stories. The natural instinct, the one every news outlet follows, is to file each piece in its own folder. Tropical storm in the Gulf here, tornado outbreak in the Midwest there, flooding in the south over here, wind threat in the northeast somewhere else. Each one gets its own segment, its own map, its own headline, and the connections between them vanish. But the connections are the whole point, the connections are the story. So let me read the entire sky as one thing, the way it actually is. Start with the diagnosis we have built, piece by piece, across this whole video. There is one enormous overloaded pattern sitting across the United States this week. It is anchored by a low-pressure system far stronger than June should allow, paired with a jet stream that belongs to a different season, drawing warm and saturated air northward out of a Gulf that is running hot months ahead of schedule. That single pattern is the engine, and everything else, every separate headline, is just that one engine expressing itself through whatever local conditions it finds. Over the plains and the Midwest, where the spin and the energy concentrate, it builds violent supercells and throws down long-track tornadoes. Over the Gulf, it spins up a tropical storm and then keeps that storm alive over land with saturated soil and a diving jet. Over the south, it wrings near-record moisture out of a thirsty sky and floods the ground. Over the northeast, days later, It slams a cold front through and threatens a windstorm. 4 headlines, 1 engine. Once you can see it that way, the individual strangeness of each piece stops being a series of coincidences and becomes a single, coherent, and frankly alarming fact. The reason Arthur can break the rules is the same reason the Midwest is under an April-grade threat in June is the same reason the South is about to flood. It is not 4 unlucky events stacked on top of each other. It is one atmosphere carrying more energy and more moisture than it can comfortably hold, and discharging that excess in every direction at once. The brown ocean that keeps Arthur alive and the supercells that spawn tornadoes and the floods and the wind are all the same overload, finding the path of least resistance in each region. This is the skill I most want you to take away from this video, more than any single fact about Arthur. When you see several extreme things happening at the same time across a continent, do not assume they are unrelated. Ask what they might have in common. Ask whether one underlying condition could be producing all of them. Because more often than people realize, the answer is yes, and seeing that connection is the difference between watching a confusing pile of disasters and understanding a single, comprehensible system. The atmosphere is not a collection of separate weather events. It is one connected fluid wrapped around the planet, and when one part of it is overloaded, the effects ripple everywhere at once. And here is where I have to be honest about both what we know and what we do not, because that honesty is the whole reason you are still here, instead of watching someone who just yells about the apocalypse. What we know for certain is the physics. The brown ocean effect is real. Divergence aloft is real. The 7% per degree moisture rule is real. The warm Gulf and the loaded atmosphere are measured facts, not opinions. What we do not know for certain is the long-term trajectory, whether weeks like this are becoming more common, whether the exception is slowly turning into the rule. That part is genuinely uncertain, actively researched, and not something I or anyone else can hand you as a settled conclusion. So I will not. I will give you the certain physics and the honest uncertainty, and let you sit with both, because that is more respect than most coverage will give you. But sitting with both leads somewhere, and it leads to the question that has been waiting at the end of this entire story. We have a storm doing the impossible, because the atmosphere handed it the means. We have an atmosphere overloaded enough to do that, this early, this strongly. And we have an open, serious scientific question about whether that overload is becoming the new normal. Put those 3 together and you arrive at the thing that should genuinely give all of us pause. The question of what happens to a world where the rules we built our understanding on slowly stop applying. But before we land on that question, there are 2 more things worth doing. First, we should look closely at the storms that have cheated death before, because Arthur is not the first, and the ones that came before it tell us exactly how seriously to take this one. And second, we should be honest about how hard this is to forecast in the first place, because the uncertainty is part of the story too. Part 15. The storms that cheated death. Arthur is not the first storm to look death in the face over land and refuse it. The reason scientists have a name for the brown ocean effect at all is that they were forced to invent one, because storms kept doing this, and the old rule could not explain it. So I want to spend a little time on the history because the past cases are the best guide we have to how seriously to take what the models are showing for Arthur this week. The storm that changed the conversation, the one I mentioned earlier, deserves a fuller telling, because it is genuinely one of the strangest tropical events in the modern record. Go back to August of 2007 to a system called Erin. Erin came ashore on the Texas coast as a weak tropical storm, so weak and so disorganized that it barely registered as a threat. It did exactly what the textbook promised. It moved inland, it lost its access to the warm Gulf, and it fell apart. Forecasters downgraded it, the headlines moved on, and as far as anyone was concerned, Erin was over. It had followed the rule. Land had killed it. Except it had not. Roughly 2 days after landfall, the remnants of Erin were drifting across Oklahoma, hundreds of miles from the ocean, when something began to happen that nobody had forecast and almost nobody believed at first. The storm started to reorganize. Over the dry interior of the continent, far from any sea, the dead storm came back to life. It deepened, its winds picked back up, and then, in the part that still stuns meteorologists who look at the radar loops, it developed a clear structure in its center that looked for all the world like an eye, the hallmark of an intensifying tropical cyclone, except this eye was spinning over Oklahoma in the middle of the night. The reborn storm produced damaging winds and torrential rain across the state. and it caused real harm, all from a system that the textbook said should have been a harmless smear of leftover moisture by then. Erin forced a reckoning. Here was a storm that had unambiguously violated the rule that land kills hurricanes, and it had done so in front of every instrument science could point at it. It could not be waved away. And so researchers went to work trying to understand how a storm could not just survive but intensify over land. And the answer that emerged was the brown ocean effect, the recognition that under the right conditions, saturated soil can hand a storm the latent heat it needs, doing the warm ocean's job from underneath. Erin became the example that anchored the whole concept, the proof that the impossible thing was not only possible but had a physical explanation. Now hold Erin next to Arthur, and feel how closely the pieces line up. A weak tropical storm that comes ashore unimpressive, wet ground waiting inland, a saturated tropical air mass surrounding it, and a forecast, or in Erin's case a reality, of survival and even strengthening where the textbook demanded death. The difference is that with Erin, in 2007, the re-intensification caught everyone by surprise because the science was not yet mature. With Arthur, in 2026, the models are showing the possibility days in advance, because we learned from storms like Erin what to look for. That is the strange gift of these rule-breaking storms. Each one that cheats death teaches us how the next one might do it. And Erin is not entirely alone. The broader recognition that came out of that era is that the remnants of tropical systems are far more dangerous and far more resilient than the simple rule suggests. Time and again, weakening or remnant systems have re-intensified, redeveloped, or simply refused to die on schedule when they found favourable conditions over land or when they reached a second body of water or a helpful jet stream. The lesson the science took from all of these cases is humility. A storm is not finished just because it has moved inland and the wind numbers have dropped. As long as it can find fuel, whether from a brown ocean of wet soil, or from a diving jet stream overhead, or from a warm coastal sea on the far side of the continent, it can keep going, and sometimes it can come roaring back. That history is exactly why I am not dismissing the Arthur forecast as a model quirk, and why you should not either. We have seen this before. We have a named phenomenon for it. We have a textbook case that did something even more dramatic than what Arthur is forecast to do. The mechanism is real, the precedent is real, and the conditions this week are favourable. When a storm has a documented history of cheating death, and the new storm is walking the same path with the same conditions, the responsible thing is to take the forecast seriously. But taking it seriously does not mean treating it as certain, and that brings us to the honest, frustrating, fascinating problem at the centre of all of this, which is just how hard a storm like Arthur is to forecast in the first place. Part 16. Why this is so hard to forecast. I have spent this entire video telling you what the models are showing, that Arthur may survive over land and reload off the Carolinas. Now I want to be completely honest with you about how confident anyone can actually be in that, because the uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Forecasting a storm like this is one of the hardest things in all of meteorology, and understanding why tells you a great deal about how the atmosphere works. Start with the basic problem. The brown ocean effect depends on conditions that are extraordinarily sensitive and hard to measure precisely. How saturated is the soil exactly across hundreds of miles of varied terrain? How much latent heat is that soil actually releasing into the storm at any given moment? How humid is the lower atmosphere along every mile of the storm's path? Tiny differences in these inputs can mean the difference between a storm that holds together and one that fizzles. Forecast models are extraordinary tools, but they are working with imperfect information about a process that turns on small margins, and that means the forecast carries real uncertainty. The models can tell us the ingredients for survival are present. They cannot tell us with certainty exactly how strong the effect will be. The same is true, maybe even more so, for the reload off the Carolinas. That outcome depends on the precise timing and position of a diving jet stream relative to the storm, days from now, after the storm has already taken a long and uncertain journey across the country. Get the timing of that jet stream slightly wrong, and the divergence aloft that would reload the storm either happens or it does not. So, when you see a forecast that says Arthur could re-strengthen off the Carolinas and might even warrant tropical storm warnings by Friday, Understand that this is a genuine possibility the models are flagging, not a certainty, and that the forecasters themselves are careful to say so. Different models show different solutions. Some are more aggressive, some less. That spread is not the forecasters being wishy-washy. It is an honest reflection of a genuinely uncertain situation. This is also the place to talk about something that gets misunderstood every single hurricane season, the forecast cone. When forecasters draw that cone on the map, people instinctively read it as the danger zone, the area that will get hit. It is not. The cone shows only the likely path of the centre of the storm, the low-pressure heart of it. It says nothing about how far the impacts spread from that centre, and with a storm like Arthur, whose whole story is moisture thrown far out ahead of and to the side of the centre, the gap between the cone and the actual impact area is enormous. People hundreds of miles from the centre, nowhere near that cone, can get flooding rain. So if you take one practical thing from this section, let it be this. Never use the cone to decide whether you are safe. The cone is about the centre. The danger is about the water, and the water goes far beyond the line on the map. Now, you might hear all this uncertainty and feel frustrated. Like the forecasters do not know what is going to happen. But I want to reframe that for you because it is actually the opposite. The fact that we can see this possibility days in advance, that we can identify the brown ocean conditions and the diving jet stream and flag the chance of an inland survival and a coastal reload before they happen, is a triumph of the science. Remember Erin in 2007, where the re-intensification blindsided everyone. We are not blindsided this time. We are watching for it, naming it, and warning about it ahead of time, precisely because we learned. The uncertainty is real, but it is uncertainty with our eyes wide open, which is an enormous improvement over being surprised. And there is a deeper reason the uncertainty matters for the bigger picture we have been building. If storms that break the rules are becoming more possible in a warmer, more loaded atmosphere, then forecasting is going to get harder, not easier, in exactly the situations where getting it right matters most. The textbook rules, land kills hurricanes, the storm weakens after landfall, are the mental shortcuts that both forecasters and the public have leaned on for generations. When storms start violating those shortcuts more often, everyone has to think harder, watch more carefully, and hold more uncertainty in mind at once. A world where the rules apply less reliably is a world that is harder to predict, and a harder world to predict is a more dangerous one to live in, not because the science is failing, but because the system itself is becoming more unruly. Which brings us finally to the question this whole storm has been asking from the moment it refused to die. Part 17. What happens when the rules stop applying? So let me bring all of it together, every thread we have followed, and land the thing that has been waiting underneath this entire story. We started with a rule, the oldest and most reliable rule in hurricane science. Land kills hurricanes. We have all carried that rule our whole lives, the simple, comforting certainty that once a storm crosses the coast, the clock starts ticking on its death. And we started with a storm, Arthur, a weak and unremarkable system that, on the 17th of June, is about to break that rule in front of all of us, surviving over land where it should die, and possibly reloading off a distant coast where it should already be a memory. We have spent this whole time answering the question of how, and the answer turned out to be a chain of mechanisms, each one real, each one documented, each one handing the storm to the next. The brown ocean of saturated soil, releasing latent heat the way the sea does, keeping the engine running over land. The diving jet stream, pulling the storm open from the top, lowering its pressure, reloading it from above. The warm shelf waters off the Carolinas, ready to feed it real ocean fuel one more time, and underneath all of it, the thirsty sky, holding near-record moisture because warmer air simply can, loading the whole system with the fuel that makes every part of this possible. That is how a storm cheats death. Not by magic and not by anyone's hidden hand, but by an atmosphere so overloaded that it hands fuel to a storm at every step of a journey that should have starved it. And here is the thread that ran underneath everything, the thing I asked you to hold on to all the way back at the beginning. Arthur refusing to die is not really a story about Arthur. It is a story about the sky Arthur was born into. The storm is ordinary, the atmosphere is not. The same overload that keeps this storm alive over land is the same overload that, 1,000 miles north, spun an April-grade tornado outbreak out of a June afternoon. It is the same overload that is flooding the south and threatening the northeast and already reloading for the weekend. One sky, carrying too much energy and too much water, discharging that excess in every direction it can find. Arthur is just the part of that overload that happened to break a famous rule, which is why it caught our eye. But it was never the storm that mattered most. It was always the sky. Now sit with the real question, the one the conspiracy theories reach for and miss, the one the serious scientists are actually asking. We know the physics that lets Arthur break the rules. What we do not know is whether weeks like this one are becoming the new shape of normal, whether an atmosphere this loaded, this early, producing storms that cheat death and outbreaks out of season, is the exception we will remember, or the baseline our children will simply expect. That is not a question I can answer for you tonight, and I would not trust anyone who claims they can. But it is the right question, and the fact that it is being asked at all, the fact that a weak June storm can make us ask it, tells you something important about the moment we are living in. Because think about what a rule actually is in science. A rule like land kills hurricanes is a compression of thousands of past observations into a single dependable expectation. It works because the world behaved consistently enough for long enough that we could trust it. Our forecasts, our warnings, our intuitions, our sense of what is safe and what is not, all of it is built on rules like that, shortcuts earned from a stable past. And the quietly unsettling thing about a storm like Arthur is not the storm itself, it is what it implies about the rules. When a storm breaks one of our most trusted rules, and breaks it not through some freak accident, but through conditions that may be becoming more common, it raises the possibility that the stable past those rules were built on is shifting underneath us, that the shortcuts we have always relied on may slowly become less reliable in exactly the moments when we need them most. That is what it means for the rules to stop applying, not that the laws of physics change, because they never will. The brown ocean effect, the jet stream, the 7% rule, those are eternal. What changes is the range of what those eternal laws produce, the menu of what the atmosphere is capable of on an ordinary day. A storm strengthening over land used to be a once-in-a-long-while curiosity, a story like Erin that scientists told each other to explain how strange the world could occasionally be. If it becomes something we see more often, then it is no longer a curiosity. It is a new normal that all of our old rules were not built to expect, and we will have to learn the sky over again, in real time, as it changes. So watch Arthur over the next few days. Watch it hold together over Mississippi and Alabama, where the textbook says it should fall apart. Watch the rain pile up far from its centre, on ground that cannot take any more. Watch, by the end of the week, to see whether it really does pull itself back together off the Carolina coast, a storm reborn from a system that should have been dead for days. And as you watch, try to see it the way I have come to see it, not as one odd storm, but as a small, clear signal from a sky that is carrying more than it used to, telling us, in the only language it has, that the rules we trusted are being tested. We have always believed that land kills hurricanes, and it still does, most of the time, in most places, under most conditions. But the most of the time is the part worth watching now, because the day the exceptions start outnumbering the rule is the day we wake up in a different world, one where the sky no longer behaves the way our grandparents promised it would, and the only thing left to do is learn its new rules as fast as it writes them. Arthur is one sentence in that new book, and if the first storm of the season is already writing in a language we are only beginning to read, then the real question is not what this one storm will do. It is how much of the old book is still true at all, and how quickly the rest of it is being rewritten over our heads, one impossible storm at a time.